Well, it's Home Bible Fellowship Week. You've gathered together in your groups, and we're going to explore together in Hebrews chapter 2 as we looked at on Sunday morning. But a wee starter question. I'm sure you've had some time to catch up with each other. But a starter question before we get into our passage. I wonder if you can think of a time in your life where you have drifted. It might be in a job, it might be in fitness, it could be in all sorts of ways, but where you've ended up somewhere you didn't really want to be and you're not entirely sure how you got there. Share a few stories, see what's happened to each other, and do a wee bit of discussion and chat. We come now to our Bible passage. We're in Hebrews chapter 2 this week. And you'll remember the last couple of weeks in chapter 1 of Hebrews, we've seen the supremacy of the Son of God, the supremacy of Jesus, and we've seen how he is above and more important and supreme in all ways over the angels. And then that leads us into chapter 2. So take a moment, whatever works in your group, but read Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 to 9, remembering the context in which it's set. You've already shared some stories about drifting. But I want you to think, first of all, it mentions drifting in our passage. What is it that causes drifting? Maybe it's easier to start with drifting on the sea. What causes something, a person on a rubber ring, to drift out at sea? But then bring that into our lives. What causes us to drift in our lives? What are the causes that cause us to go away from where we want to be and end up somewhere else? What causes that? On Sunday morning, I had 3 words or phrases that were our 3 points as we move through the passage. And we're going to use those as we work through it tonight and as we think about the different things in this passage. The words were must, the phrase closer attention, and then finally we. They're found in verse 1. I did them slightly out of order, but let's look at those together. So particularly focusing on verses 2 to 4 tells us we must do something. So I want you to think about the question of why must we pay closer attention? There's 3 things in the passage to look at and to discuss. We're told about the reliability of the message. What makes it reliable? What is the content of the message of this great salvation? And finally, what is the cost of drifting? So have these 3 things in mind as you discuss why must we do something. So think about reliability, content, and cost. Why must we do something? Our second part was about closer attention. Closer attention. In fact, it says much closer attention. We're looking at verses 5 to 9 particularly for this section. Here's a few questions for you to look at. What is mankind given at the creation of the Lord, at the creation of man? What does God say to him? What does God task him with? What responsibility and role does man have? We know that that's spoiled by sin. And Jesus achieves as a perfect man what we haven't. So the question is, what has Jesus achieved? And how has he done it? What has Jesus achieved that we pay closer attention to? And how has he done it? And how does that impact our lives? Finally, we have this we. It's the first thing. I needed to have it last, otherwise my bottle wouldn't have leaked enough. But we. It's now time to get practical. You're there as a group. How can you together pay much closer attention to the gospel? How can you do that? How can you spur one another on? How can you watch each other's backs? How can you help one another? And I want you particularly to think of the question, what does it look like to live the gospel? What does it look like to live the gospel? We believe the gospel as we're saved, but each and every day we're called to live the gospel, for the gospel to make an impact on our lives, for it to be evident in the things that we do. So how do we do that as individuals, and how do we help one another as we must pay much closer attention? How do we do that? As you've spent time discussing all these things, I'm sure there's many things that have come out. So make sure you spend some time praying for one another. That is one way that we can help each other out, can spur one another on by praying for one another and supporting. So make sure you spend good time praying, as well as thinking of practical ways to pay much closer attention. See you next time.